In 1987, the world didn't have a single defining image. There was no accident that paralyzed the planet like the year before, no brutal and concentrated moment that overshadowed everything else. What there was, instead, was an accumulation of signals. Leaders sitting down to sign agreements that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Scandals that called into question the transparency of the most powerful governments on Earth. Markets collapsing simultaneously across different continents. And songs crossing oceans without needing translation. It was a year that didn't shout, but had a lot to say. The Cold War was still the backdrop against which almost everything else was built. Since the early part of the decade, the fear of nuclear conflict had been a constant presence. Missiles aimed from both sides of the world, arms races, confrontational rhetoric. But in 1987, the tone shifted. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, two leaders with completely different histories and worldviews that had been opposed for years, signed the INF Treaty in December, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The agreement eliminated an entire category of nuclear weapons, ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between roughly 300 and 3,400 miles. For the first time in Cold War history, the two superpowers weren't just agreeing to limit the growth of their arsenals. They were committing to destroy weapons that already existed. It was a real shift, not just a rhetorical one. Gorbachev had been leading the Soviet Union for just over 2 years and had already made clear that his approach would be different. His policies of glasnost and perestroika, openness and internal restructuring, were slowly transforming the Soviet political climate. Reagan, who years earlier had called the USSR the evil empire, sat down with him in Reykjavik in 1986 and in Washington in 1987 to work through concrete negotiations. The relationship between the two men was complicated and not free of suspicion, but the willingness to negotiate was real. The INF Treaty was its most tangible result. It didn't mean the end of the Cold War, but it was a signal that the logic of unlimited confrontation had, at least, some exits. While that was happening, American domestic politics was going through one of its most uncomfortable moments in years. The Iran-Contra affair had broken in late 1986, but it was in 1987 that congressional hearings exposed it to the public in its full complexity. The story, in basic terms, was this. Officials in the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran, a country with which the United States officially had no relations, and had diverted part of the proceeds to fund the Contras, the guerrilla group fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Congress had explicitly prohibited that funding. What came to light was a network of covert operations running outside the bounds of institutional oversight, with figures like Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North at the center. The televised hearings showed an officer who apologized for nothing and an administration trying to contain the damage. Reagan's popularity held up in ways that surprised many observers, but the scandal made clear just how far foreign policy could operate in spaces where accountability was, at best, murky. In October, a different kind of shock arrived from the financial markets. On the 19th of that month, a day that became known as Black Monday, stock markets around the world fell simultaneously and dramatically. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost more than 22% in a single day, the largest single-day percentage drop in its history up to that point. But the most revealing thing wasn't the percentage itself. It was the speed and the synchrony. Markets in London, Hong Kong, Sydney, and other financial centers fell as well, in varying degrees, almost at the same time. Technology had made it possible for financial transactions to happen in real time on a global scale, and that meant a localized panic could become an international crisis within hours. The world economy was more interconnected than many governments and analysts had been willing to acknowledge. Black Monday didn't trigger a depression like 1929, partly because central banks intervened quickly, but it left a sense of fragility that wasn't easily forgotten. On the other side of the world, in the occupied Palestinian territories, December brought the beginning of the First Intifada. For months, tension between the Palestinian population and Israeli forces had been building in the West Bank and Gaza. A traffic accident that killed Palestinian workers became the spark that set off mass protests, strikes, and clashes that would continue for years. The First Intifada changed how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was perceived internationally. Images of young people throwing stones at soldiers equipped with modern weapons circulated through media outlets around the world and brought the conflict into global attention in a new way. It was a conflict with decades of history and layers of complexity that didn't allow for easy simplifications. But 1987 marked a turning point in how it unfolded. And while all of that was playing out on the front pages, popular culture kept moving at its own pace, relentless and all-consuming. Michael Jackson released Bad in August, his first album in 5 years, and the follow-up to Thriller. Matching what that record had been was essentially impossible, but Bad was a massive success, regardless. It produced 5 #1 singles in the United States, a record at the time, and cemented Jackson's place as the most visible figure in popular music worldwide. U2, meanwhile, released The Joshua Tree in March and shifted their sound toward something more austere, more rooted in American musical references, more ambitious in scope. The album was an immediate critical and commercial success, and elevated the Irish band to a level of popularity that very few rock acts had ever reached. Whitney Houston remained an unstoppable force with her second album. George Michael released Faith in October and proved he could build a serious solo career outside of Wham, with a record that blended soul, pop, and a deliberately adult image. Madonna continued her creative evolution. Global pop was being heard on every continent, and MTV was still the channel where that sound took visual shape. Music videos were no longer just a supplement to the music. They were part of the product, part of the experience. An artist's image, their presence on screen, their aesthetic, mattered as much as the songs themselves. At the movies, 1987 offered a wide range. RoboCop, directed by Paul Verhoeven, blended science fiction, stylized violence, and social satire with an effectiveness that made it a defining film of the genre. Dirty Dancing arrived with a modest budget and became a phenomenon nobody had predicted, with a soundtrack that stayed on the charts for months. Fatal Attraction tapped into the anxieties of suburban middle-class life and the weight of personal choices made in secret. Good Morning Vietnam used Robin Williams to talk about war with humor and melancholy at the same time. They were very different films, but together they showed an industry that still knew how to speak to mass audiences with stories that had something to say. At home, Nintendo was solidifying its presence. The NES had been in the North American market for 2 years, and video games had moved from being a passing trend to a stable part of family entertainment. Personal computers were also continuing to spread, though without the ubiquity they would have a decade later. The digital world was quietly advancing, introducing millions of people to interacting with screens in ways that had previously been reserved for specialists. That same year, the world's population reached 5 billion people. It was a number that was hard to fully grasp, but it said something concrete about the scale of the planet at that moment. More people, more cities, more needs, more connections. A world growing faster than its ability to understand itself. 1987 ended without a sharp conclusion, the way almost all real years do. The missiles covered by the Washington Agreement would take years to actually be destroyed. Political scandals left scars that healed slowly. Markets recovered, but the memory of the crash lingered. The year's songs kept playing, and the decade moved into its final stretch with a strange mix of openness and fragility, as if something was on the verge of reorganizing itself, without anyone quite knowing yet what shape it would take.